Знаю, где они. Пошли. И балда! Пошли. Я не тут. Близко. Любить. Рожать.
Да, это я сказал. Без детей выходи. А дети оставить. Du besetzt. Ich habe so gesagt, weil alles seinen Ursprung in Kindern hat.
Я так сказал, потому что из детей начинается все.
Ihr dürft nicht existieren.
Вас не должно быть.
Nicht jedes Volk hat das Recht auf Zukunft.
И все народы имеют право на будущее.
Слушать. Всем слушать.
In der Welt gerassen sind es nämlich den Bacillus des Kommunismus gebären.
Низшие расы плодят заразу коммунизма.
Ihr dürft nicht bestehen.
Вас не должно быть.
In 1982, there was a British journalist by the name of Robert Fisk. He was living in Lebanon covering the Lebanese Civil War. And he saw a lot of the fighting, he saw the shelling, he saw the explosions, he saw a lot of the intensity of the fighting, and he wrote a great deal on it. In the Lebanese Civil War, you had mainly two sides fighting each other. On one side, you had the Lebanese Phalangists, who were fascists inspired by Adolf Hitler, and they believed in the supremacy of the Phoenician race in Lebanon, and so they had this idea that they had the right to purge Lebanon of foreigners. On the other side, you had the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and these people were Palestinian nationalists, and they were also terrorists who didn't mind killing civilians, and they believed in fighting for a Palestinian state. And they wanted to defeat the Israelis and carve out a Palestinian state. And so they made Lebanon their headquarters because the Palestinians at one point in time fled into Lebanon as refugees after they were defeated by the Israelis. Now, relations between the Lebanese and the Palestinians were more or less cordial at one point in time, but eventually the Palestinians ended up having these grandiose ideas of a Palestinian state, and so they wanted to use Lebanon as a central headquarter for their operations. Eventually, Israel got involved, they intervened, and there was a bloody war between the Phalangists, who were the proxies of the Israelis, and the Palestinians. You also had other factions involved. You had the Syrians. You also had Iranian, Shiite militias. these Shiites would eventually become Hezbollah, who today are backed by the Iranians. So, Robert Fisk, he lived in Lebanon for years. And in the year 1982, he was told that there was a massacre that took place in a particular area. So he and his colleague, they drove to this place and they didn't see the aftermath of any massacre. So they thought, well, maybe we were given false information. So they got back into their car and they started driving, and they passed by this particular place. They passed by a refugee camp called Shatila. At this point, the PLO was pretty much leaving Lebanon. There was a peace agreement, supposedly, and the PLO were supposed to leave. That was part of the agreement. So the PLO militias were sent to other parts of the Middle East. The problem was that with the PLO gone, Palestinian refugee camps were left without any sort of defense because they were just filled with refugees, and these refugees were unarmed, and there were no gunmen to protect them. So the Phalangists, they saw easy prey. They saw unarmed people. And they were thirsty for blood. So Robert Fisk and his colleague, they were driving past this refugee camp called Shatila, and his colleague said, "Stop here. There's something about this place that is very strange." And they noticed the clouds of flies in the air. And these aren't Western flies. These are Middle Eastern flies. These flies bite you. They feed off of the dead. I want to read to you guys an excerpt from Fisk's book. It's called Pity the Nation. And I want to read to you guys just a few of these lines, just to give you an idea. "It was the flies that told us. There were millions of them. Their hum almost as eloquent as the smell. Big as blue bottles, they covered us, unaware at first of the difference between the living and the dead. And they couldn't talk while they were in Shatila, because if they talked, the flies would enter their mouths. The flies were on their flesh, biting them, because there was a feast that was going on. They were feeding off of the flesh of the dead. And as they walked through this town, they saw an innumerable amount of bodies covering the roads, bodies covering the streets and the sidewalks. There were so many bodies that you would think that you saw a rock on the floor, but in reality it was a human head. You were just looking for something that wasn't a dead body, and you couldn't find it. You thought you saw a small stone on the floor, but in reality it was a human elbow sticking from underneath the earth because the corpse was quickly buried underneath the ground. Then they heard a car, and they knew that there were some phalange walking around. So they went into a random backyard, and there they saw the body of a woman, freshly killed, bullet holes. Well, there was a bullet hole on her chest. Her eyes were wide open. In fact, many of the bodies that they saw, their eyes were wide open, as if they were still alive, as if they were still looking at you. And they saw this young woman on the floor, and there were clothes hanging from clotheslines, a clothesline. And she had just been doing her laundry when these fascists entered her backyard and murdered her in cold blood. As they heard the car driving away, they exited the backyard and they continued to walk, and they saw the countless corpses, women on the floor with their dresses up, their legs spread apart. These women were raped. They would walk into the homes and they would find the homes emptied, but they would go into the bedroom, the master bedroom, the main bedroom, and they would find the whole family dead. Because when the Falungist gunmen entered the home, the families had nowhere else to go. They had no guns. They had no way to protect themselves, and so they would go into the bedroom. That was their last defense, but it was no defense at all. They were all massacred. They would see the babies on the floor. They would see the mothers on the floor. They would see... It was horrific. Absolutely horrific. Bodies everywhere. People with their throats slit. Women on the floor with their bodies split open because they would rip the fetuses out. This was the reality of what the Civil War entailed. And it just amazes me that you will have Catholics today, Western Catholics, Lebanese Catholics, who say, oh, the Falungists were great. They were great patriots. They were great Christian warriors. But yet these same Catholics will sit there and tell me about how pro-life they are. They will sit there and criticize other people and say, well, that person's not pro-life. They're not pro-life. Oh, this person criticized my favorite political candidate. Well, that candidate's pro-life. Aren't they pro-life? But yet these same people will say, oh, the wonderful Falungist. The wonderful patriots. This was the horror of Civil War. This is the horror of Civil War. And then you have these knuckleheads who walk around, 1776, 1776. We need to have an uprising. We need to have a civil war. No, you don't. No, you don't. And then you have these people talking about how mad they are. I'm mad as hell. I'm so angry. I'm mad as hell right now. Haven't you ever seen these people? You see them on Fox News. You see them on other media outlets. I remember I saw this video and it was a room filled with Democrats and Republicans. And the guy who was interviewing them said, who here is mad as hell? And everyone raised their hands. They're all mad as hell. What are you mad about? What are you so angry about? What? You have a job. You're not starving to death. Most likely you're overweight. What are you angry about? What, you're working at a grocery store? Well, if you were living in a gulag somewhere, you wouldn't be working in a grocery store. You'd be starving to death. What are you angry about? Oh, I'm working behind a cash register. Oh, I'm working at a factory. I'm so angry. I'm so upset. You're lucky to have work. If you were living in some despotic society, you'd be lucky to be working at a grocery store. You would be happy to be working at a factory because you'd be maybe in a gulag, maybe in a concentration camp where you don't work. Well, you do work. And what do you get paid with? You get paid with, I don't know, a turnip, some water, or a bullet in the head once you can't work any longer and they see you as completely useless to their machine. What are we so upset about? Everyone's so angry. People are talking about civil war. Why do you think when you listen to right-wing radio, and I've listened to right-wing radio for years, why do you think when you listen to right-wing radio, they have in the advertisements, buy MREs? Buy these MREs. Buy these military dinners where you put boiled water on top of it or something. Buy these dinners. The military uses them. Don't you want to be like a soldier? Because they know their clientele. They know all these people are fantasizing about civil war. And some of them want civil war. Now, some of them will say, well, we don't want civil war, but if it ever comes down to it, we have to be prepared. And I can understand that sentiment. But you have these people who want civil war. And they're like, oh, I got myself an MRE. It's like, yeah, well, you paid an arm and a leg for those. You were better off just buying you're better off buying like 20 sacks of whole wheat from the local chicken feed store and buying a whole crate filled with canned beans and other canned foods and canned sardines and tuna fish. But that's beside the point. The point is that people are fantasizing about civil war, and yet they don't even understand what they're getting themselves into. You don't understand, because if there was a civil war, this massacre, this Shatila massacre, That's what would be happening. Probably worse, because we're living in the US where there are more guns than people. All these people screaming, 1776, 1776. Yeah. These are the same people who complain about refugees, and yet they want to create the circumstances in which they themselves would become refugees. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.